Welcome to Politics and Psychology. Today we are discussing gaslighting slavery. And because pretty much everyone who listens to this podcast, you are a person who is intellectual and truth seeking, but because we are talking about slavery and this highlights factors of race and racism, please remember that our conversation today will be based on an intellectual discussion of slavery and systemic racism, and it's from a social scientific understanding and with love for all persons rather than promoting hate for one race over another. So let's begin. In the past 3 years, there has been a significant increase in legislation that gaslights the history of slavery in our country. Now, gaslighting is a form of manipulation, and you may hear it a lot in social media lately, and they're linking it to narcissism or narcissistic personalities or people that they think are narcissists. But in any way, gaslighting is a form of psychological control and manipulation where there is a deliberate and systematic giving of false information, with that false information being given in such a way that it's consistent and complete enough to make the victim believe that what they think to be true is not true, will cause them to question or doubt themselves, doubt their memory, doubt their perception of reality, or just doubt reality altogether. The way gaslighting is occurring in current legislation in our country is that since 2022, there has been a deliberate and systematic giving of false information about the history of slavery and the current long-term effects of slavery that still exist in our society today. Moreover, there is a deliberate denial of how oppressive laws and behaviors that existed during slavery are now being adapted and implemented in the year of 2024, which is our current society for how we know it. This gaslighting is occurring in education, economy, free speech, and political messaging. So in education, it's occurring by preventing the academic study of history through the manipulation of historical events. In the economy, by making laws that strategically financially benefit predominantly white persons, businesses, and institutions, and strategically oppresses those for persons of color. Free speech, by censoring and making it illegal to discuss historical truths committed by members of the white or Caucasian race in the past. And political messaging, by promoting the message that speech, conversations, and practices that discuss or attempt to address the injustices that occurred during slavery are actually causing an injustice to white or Caucasian persons. So this gaslighting is also occurring by making political statements and legislation to make it illegal to favor one race over another, but at the same time, these same laws allow for the protection and privilege for only the Caucasian race, and that's what we are going to discuss today. And let's examine the actual occurrences of gaslighting slavery, starting with education. For kindergarten through undergraduate state colleges, 10 states have already passed laws since 2022 to manipulate the accurate teaching of history. For example, in Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, and 7 other states, they have made it illegal to discuss the roles of race in slavery and to be illegal to specifically discuss the historical role that white persons have played in the death of Native Americans and the mass enslaving of African Americans. In addition, some of these states, such as Florida, want the teaching of slavery to include curriculum content that minimizes the trauma of being enslaved. The specific language occurs in the Florida law under the 2022 Individual Freedom Bill, which is called House Bill 7 or HB 7, and I will refer to it throughout our conversation today. Now, this bill requires the State Board of Education to include topics of slavery and African American history, not as part of history, but more so as part of their life skills curriculum. And they are including this under the curriculum for character development requirements and under health education, specifically for mental and emotional health, and this is for grades 9 through 12. And under the required instruction for this law, it requires the schools, the public schools, to expand the teaching of slavery to include, quote, stories of inspiration about how Black people were able to learn valuable skills by being a slave. It also requires that there's a teaching lesson for slavery being a difficult circumstance, but that it's a difficult circumstance that slaves were able to overcome, and that you too, by having the individual freedom to develop life skills and personal characteristics of hard work and excellence, that you too can overcome other difficult circumstances and you can prosper. The problem with that is that they are minimizing the actual trauma that enslaved persons experienced in the past and continue to experience in present day, but instead of focusing on the psychological distress of the white students by talking about slavery in the history component. So therefore, they're changing the language to go under life skills and preventing it from being told in a way that would place blame or assign identity to any race who is responsible for the enslavement of other individuals, so that the white students won't be distressed. However, they are failing to include in this same legislation any consideration that Black students experience by knowing that they came from enslaved persons. So it's a little bit lopsided there, and it's not really focusing on an balance of equality. The bill also states that it's illegal to say or to teach, this is a specific language here, that a person, by virtue of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin, bears personal responsibility for and must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress because of actions in which the person played no part, committed in the past by other members of the same race, color, national origin, or sex. This bill from Florida, remember HB 7, it was created in Florida by Governor DeSantis, who signs it into law, but it ended up becoming the blueprint for the other 9 states that adopted and wrote into law similar language and similar legislation for their state boards of education. And these are the 10 states that we are going to specifically focus on today, because these are the 10 states that actually implemented this legislation within the past 3 years. Alabama, Florida, Idaho, Indiana, North Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. And some of these states are also leading the nation in banning books that discuss the harsh realities of slavery, and these are Florida, Texas, and Utah. So when we apply the behavior of gaslighting, remember the definition, and it includes the systematic giving of false information. And this false information can be given directly by introducing false information or indirectly by removing true information. So by introducing false information that slavery was not a harsh condition, but was instead a difficult circumstance, and that by removing the books, which would be removing the truths about what did occur, this is a way of controlling the information and creating a false narrative, and thereby gaslighting. So let's think about it from the personal standpoint. And let's use an example of relationships such as a dating relationship. In a gaslighting occurrence, you might see for dating, a boyfriend is telling his girlfriend that the text messages that she found of him texting another girl are not really from him, but from his friend instead, and that his friend was the one cheating, and he was just letting his friend hold the phone so he can contact this girl without the other girlfriend knowing. So we're seeing the giving of false information by the cheating boyfriend, saying that it wasn't his text messages, that he is not cheating, and adding in additional information by saying it was someone else's phone text messages. Then he may act angry and even blame his girlfriend for, one, violating his privacy by going through his telephone, and then blaming her for unfairly accusing him. So not only is he introducing false information, he is omitting factual information, and then he's adding in the third component, which is making himself the victim. And he'll continue to play the role of the victim in this example and will emotionally manipulate her through the silent treatment or withholding other types of kindness from her until she is the one who feels guilty and then apologizes. When in actuality, the boyfriend was indeed cheating the whole time, but he was deliberately giving her false information to make the girlfriend question the reality and what she knew to be true. And this is how HB7 is applying the gaslighting tactics in the same way. And these tactics are, as we mentioned, giving false information that slavery was a difficult circumstance and that many Black slaves learned new skills that they also benefited from by removing the truthful information from history lessons, by removing and banning the books and the information from the school curriculum, the school books, and the school libraries, and then by arguing that even discussing the facts about slavery or the whole truth about slavery and any harm that was enacted is indeed an injustice and causing harm to the perpetrator of those acts rather than the victims or the recipients of that harmful enslavement. So now let's examine the category of the economy. And again, we'll stick to just the 10 states that I previously named. And we're also going to go back to our cheating boyfriend example. With the gaslighting, you have to control more and more of an argument so that the false information is believed and that the truth is either doubted or completely disregarded. And this is where the arguments against DEI are introduced. So, like with House Bill 7 in Florida, the language for all 10 states include that it is illegal for, and this is the exact language, a person by virtue of his or her race, color, national origin, or sex to be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment for achieving diversity, equity, or inclusion, or that a person by virtue of his or her race, color, national origin, or sex bears responsibility for or should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by other members of that same race, color, national origin, or sex. But before we go further, let's look at what is DEI. So the D stands for diversity, the I stands for inclusion, and this relates to different demographics of diversity, such as both genders, different religions, age groups, nationalities, etc., and then those being demographics of diversity. And then the E is for equity. E is different, or equity is different, in that diversity and inclusion focus on the different demographics having equal access to the same opportunities, whereas equity focuses on creating fairness and how that equal access is created and achieved. In legal terms, because these laws against the DEI are created in legal terms, equity is the recognition that in certain circumstances, different treatment may be required for different demographics to achieve fairness and justice. The words fair and fairness are reflected in each of the laws for these 10 states. And they do state that for every person, regardless of race, they should be treated fairly, which is true. It also states that it is unfair to one, make white persons include non white persons in their hiring, academic admissions, or programming decisions, but that it's also two, unfair for non whites to exclude white persons from their hiring, academic admissions, or programming decisions. So let's go back to the cheating boyfriend example again. And the girlfriend will say she eventually accepts the truth and she realizes that her boyfriend is lying, but because she loves him, then she stays with him anyway. Then one day they're having an argument. She's tired of it. She goes out, meets someone new, cheats on her boyfriend. When he finds out, he's angry, and of course, he breaks up with her. The girlfriend is pleading, please, 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 stay with me, come back, and I only did what you did, and I forgave you. But then he replies, well, that was different, and leaves her anyway. So the gaslighting tactics that the boyfriend is using is reverse logic and reverse victimizing. And it's these same tactics that the 10 states are using to justify their decades long practices of unfairness against non whites while making it illegal for non whites to do the same. For example, Tennessee is one of the states that we are examining, and Tennessee has two primary universities. They are University of Tennessee, which is a predominantly white institution, and then they have Tennessee State University, which is a predominantly black institution, also known as an HBCU, which is a historically black college or university. In a 2021 federal report, the government found that the state of Tennessee has inequitable funding practices and that their inequity in their funding caused a severe financial gap from 1987 to 2020, with more than $2.1 billion for TSU not being given to them, and also with the state giving TSU $544 million less than it gave UT, or University of Tennessee, in matching funds for land grant institutions for the past 3 decades or 30 years. So, what this means is that although the federal government sent funding to the state of Tennessee under a land grant, this land grant requires Tennessee to equally divide the funding to both TSU and UT, and it requires the state of Tennessee to match those funds equally and to give those funds equally to each university. However, Tennessee never gave the HBCU the money for years, and that's where they got up to the $2.1 billion. But it did not only give their share of the grant funding to University of Tennessee, which is the predominantly white institute, it also often gave them more than what was supposed to have been their equal share from the federal government or their equal share from the Tennessee state matching of those funds. Another one of the 10 states that is enacting these inequitable funding practices in education is North Carolina. And like with University of Tennessee, the state of North Carolina has two universities, one being North Carolina A&T, which is an HBCU, and North Carolina State, which is a PWI, or predominantly white institute. And North Carolina underfunded their HBCU of North Carolina A&T also by nearly $2 billion. But now let's go back to Tennessee and let's look at the numbers. Like, what does that look like? Well, in just fiscal year 2020 through 2021, the state of Tennessee gave UT $69,721,300 and gave TSU, which is the black school, $8,674,200. In fiscal year 2019, the state of Tennessee gave University of Tennessee $69,369,000 and gave TSU $8,674,200, the same as what they did in the following year, fiscal year 2021. And this disparity in their funding goes back for over 30 years, with the University of Tennessee, which was the predominantly white institution, being consistently given preferential treatment via the state funding since 1969 at minimum. So, although the laws are requiring since almost 2021 that we need and not give preferential treatment for minority institution or for anything that focuses on giving an equitable opportunity or equitable funding for any race, we do still see practices of not giving equitable treatment, but instead giving a privileged treatment or an inequitable opportunity and inequitable funding for certain types of schools rather than for other types of schools. And you're not seeing an equal treatment for all persons, as these laws are stating, for all persons to receive the same treatment. So this is the wording that's being used, but it's not the practices that are actually occurring. So for the category of economy, Gaslighting through legislation is occurring by requiring one race to be treated fairly and not discriminated against, but then also allowing for another race to be unfairly treated and discriminated against through practices such as inequities in funding or deliberate discrimination in the dissemination of funds that are legally required to be split equally. And this is occurring not only in the colleges, but also at the lower levels of K through 12 or kindergarten through the 12th grade. And this is happening with the schools in predominantly white neighborhoods receiving more funding than the schools in the neighborhoods that are predominantly maintaining and housing individuals that are persons of color. And so when you have an inequity at the root in education and educational resources, then you're going to necessarily or naturally have one group of individuals who will thrive and will appear to have worked harder to achieve their gains. And you'll also have another group who will not be able to aspire as high, as often, or as easily because they did not receive the equal amount of resources. And when you don't have the equal amount of academic resources, it then will affect your academic performance on college admission tests, such as the SATs or the ACTs. And then those lower scores will either prevent you from getting scholarships, prevent you from getting into a college, or put you in a position where you can't get into college that you want, or you cannot pursue the career that you want. So then you're forced into a lower income or a lower potential job and career. And this is how the system of an oppression in an economy is created just by inequities in funding that are, although they're saying it's not race based, it is race consistent on who receives and who does not receive. And this is what we see, for example, in the same 10 states that are arguing against equity and against fairness. So, equity again means everyone has a fair chance. And by these states making it illegal to promote equity, which means both kids or both groups of kids get the same amount of books, have the same quality of teachers, being paid at the same rate, and having an equal chance to go to the colleges of their choice, then by promoting laws that make it illegal to be equitable, then these laws are really saying that, well, we don't want fairness and equality for all, except for when it benefits us. And if it doesn't benefit us, then we don't want equity or fairness. We just want it to just benefit me if we had to choose. And this is unkind and it is unloving. And it's creating a system that primarily benefits one race and tells other races that, well, if you work hard, you too can prosper. But it ignores the historical truths of how it was the hard work of slaves that is the foundation for their prosperity, both then and now, and also the current practices of disparity that are preventing people, regardless of how hard they work, from being able to achieve at the same levels. And this is why we are having although we don't have the legal slavery existing in America now, but while we do have the presence of widespread discrimination and being done in a systematic way that is racially oppressive. So let's look back at the numbers. So we already see where Tennessee and North Carolina are practicing discrimination and unfair funding practices, and they are indeed giving preferential treatment to one race. These states, along with the other 8 states, are also engaging in unfair practices in other areas. In the 2020 Equality Rankings Report, which is produced by the U.S. Newsweek magazine, the analysts measured the level of fairness and equity in each of the 50 states. So Alabama is ranking 46th in the country for the degree of income gap by gender, with females in that state being paid significantly less than males. Florida ranks 36, and again, this is one main out of all 50 states, 50 is the lowest. So Florida is ranking 36 for their labor force gap by gender, with females being employed significantly less than males. Idaho is number 48 for labor force gap by gender. Indiana is 38 for income gap by gender, and it's also number 38 for labor force gap by gender. North Carolina ranks 32 for income gap by race. North Dakota ranks 46 for unemployment gap by race, with more whites employed than non whites. Tennessee ranks 31 for unemployment gap by race. Texas is number 46 for the income gap by race and number 49 for labor force gap by gender and number 44 for racial disparity in education. Utah is number 50 for labor force gap by gender, 48 for income gap by gender, and 38 for racial disparity in education. And then Wyoming is 50 for income gap by gender and also ranking 31 for income gap by race. So, in each of these 10 states, making it illegal to teach or say that one race oppresses another, and to teach that no race is superior to another, and therefore all races must be treated with fairness. Although these words sound compassionate to say, it's an actual misrepresentation of the truth that's actually occurring in their states. In education, in employment, and in income, these states are consistently engaging in unfair practices that do discriminate, but they discriminate against non whites by providing one, academic resources and funding at a lower rate to schools in communities of colors versus those that are in predominantly white communities, two, consistently hiring males more than females, and three, consistently paying males significantly higher than the females that they do employ. So, with the Florida HB 7 bill and the statutes written by the other 9 states, each of these laws specifically make it illegal to teach that discrimination exists against a person because of his or her race or his or her gender. Yet, they also do enact practices of hiring and funding that do specifically discriminate against individuals because of their race or gender. And this is another example of the legal form of social gaslighting. By saying that what is happening is not really happening and deliberately providing false information by making statements that are not true and by misdirecting attention to make oneself appear as the victim rather than recognizing the truly victimized individuals. So, gaslighting is also not wanting to be accountable for what you say. In this case, the legislation in these states is not being accountable for what they are saying and also what is legally required to do. So, meaning the governors and the political leaders claim that they want fairness to all races, but then they make it illegal to actually implement programs or practices that help to achieve the fairness that they say that they want. In fact, Texas has gone so far as requiring all state funded entities to provide an annual report attesting to the fact that they have not engaged in any activity related to equity. Now, how oppressive does that sound that you're making it illegal to help others, illegal to provide funding and programs to any racial group that has been historically marginalized, underserved, or underfunded? Well, you do this by rewriting and retelling history to make it appear as if none of these racial or gender injustices ever happened. So, in short, by gaslighting. And this leads us to states like Alabama, again, one of the 10 states that's making it illegal to fully teach the history of slavery in America. And their laws also make it illegal for anyone to accept, acknowledge, affirm, or assent to a sense of guilt, complicity, or a need to apologize on the basis of his or her race, color, religion, sex, ethnicity, or national origin. And this same language is also in the other 9 states. And these laws also add that no race should feel guilty or be discriminated against for the past actions of others in their same race. But they deliberately omit the word slavery and deliberately omit identifying the racial group responsible for these acts. So obviously, the legislation refers to white persons not having to acknowledge the role of race in slavery, nor does it mention any other race because individuals of the white race were the ones who were the only ones enslaving others in our country. But by omitting this information and deliberately leaving out the word slavery and the word white, it attempts to omit the truth of who did what, to whom, and when. In short, it's gaslighting by omission and by deflecting responsibility. Now, let's first be compassionate to everyone who's involved in this conversation. And it is true and it is fair that everyone should be treated with respect and no one should be guilted into being responsible for anything that was done by someone else. And it's not fair to blame all white persons living today for the acts of white enslavers in the past. And not all white persons are racist. In fact, it's because of the contributions of many white persons, along with their black peers, who helped abolish slavery. It's also a fact that many white persons who hold political office today have voted against these bills that are making it illegal to provide equitable opportunities, or they have voted against the academic censoring of the true facts of slavery and race. But it is the fact that of the 79 anti equity bills that were introduced throughout the 50 states, 77 of these bills were introduced by Republicans and two were from bipartisan support. So are all Republicans racist? No. But it does point to the fact that the laws to make equity illegal and to censor truths about slavery are strongly connected to political party, at least in our present day political system. Several of these Republicans are also descendants of ancestors who were slaveholders. For example, Congressman Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Pete Sessions from Texas, Nancy Mace also from South Carolina, and there are others. And other Republican politicians passing these laws is the individuals who are Republicans who are more aligned with the extreme beliefs and loyalties that are heavily influenced by racism, who are promoting this political messaging that non-whites are taking away opportunities and funding from white persons. And as a result, it's white persons who are being discriminated against and therefore making equity unfair and discriminatory against white individuals. But if we look at the data objectively, we can see that clearly this is not the case. Let's look at another form of data. In the 2021 United Nations report, the United States was given a failing grade for our failure to deliver on the promise of racial equality. The research report found that on average, white communities receive resources and services at a rate 3 times higher than the least served racial group in the United States. And the report then went on to rank each of our 50 states according to our degree of racial inequality and in delivering social determinants. In the United Nations report, they define education quality as ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. So now let's look and see where the 10 states that we've been focusing on during this discussion rank out of all the 50 states in our country, at least according to this UN report. So, what we see is that each of these 10 states received the lowest score for education quality, meaning that they rank the lowest in providing inclusive and equitable quality education, and that they did not promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. In short, they did not have fairness. Each state was also cited for major deficits, which is the lowest ranking category, and having the highest scores for racial disparity in education. And they specifically had the highest scores for racial disparities and the highest occurrence of major deficits in the categories of bachelor's degree and middle school. So, as we can see, whether it's a US based report such as Newsweek or it's a global report by the UN examining the performance of all the states and all the countries, then we're seeing that America is significantly in deficit of actually providing fairness and justice for all. Instead, there is a consistency and a strategic, systematic way of providing more equitable opportunities to individuals within one race and excluding those from the others or the other races. The U.S. Newsweek report also analyzed the level of equity in our country, and they did ranking similarly to the UN's report according to the 50 states. And of the 50 states, there are four of the states of our 10 states that we're examining today that fell within the lower categories. Specifically, Alabama ranked 44, Indiana ranked 50, North Dakota ranked 37, and Texas ranked 39 in equity, meaning that four of the 10 states were also lower ranking in internal, meaning in America, external, meaning outside entities, measuring our overall equity in our country. So, intellectually speaking, at the core of the anti DEI laws being implemented is the gaslighting of slavery through the suppression and censoring of history, the omission of truth, and the promotion of misinformation. The opposing of equity practices, equity teachings, and programs is because the definition of equity is the recognition that in certain circumstances, different treatment may be required to achieve fairness and justice. But if you had true equity based off of this definition, it would require an acknowledgement that one, not only did slavery exist and that the slavery effects still impact us today, but it would also require an acknowledgement that there is one race that was solely responsible for the circumstances of slavery, and the attempts to suppress this part of history and to act as if it's unfair to white persons by non-white to mention that this is happening, that this is an injustice, then that is gaslighting. So just remember, our conversation today is not and was not an opportunity to place blame or guilt, but to intellectually discuss that making it illegal to provide equity and equitable opportunities is a modern day promotion of racial oppression. And attempts to legally suppress the truths about our country's past and using political messaging that says we are fighting for fairness in America, but still holding on to unfair practices is, in essence, gaslighting. And thus, gaslighting is hurting all Americans, not just one race and not just another. Because, like with the cheating boyfriend example that we've been using, gaslighting prevents an honest look at what has happened and keeps all parties in a state of unrest, frustration, and projecting fears and insecurities on each other. And it also promotes political and racial division. But if we really want the best for everyone, if we want to have honest conversations, then we have to be honest and we have to truly want the best for everyone. We have to also give all parties the tools they need to heal. We have to forgive. We have to be committed to moving forward and doing so without selfishness, but with compassion for all persons involved. But of course, with all new behaviors, remember the psychology of behavioral change, this type of change is only possible when you really want to change and when you're really willing to do the uncomfortable work and have the uncomfortable conversations to create that change. And with you listening today, I thank you, because I know this could be an uncomfortable conversation, but I thank you for listening and listening all the way through. And if you, like me, are wanting a society that is truly fair to all people, then please think about what we have discussed today and consider sharing the objective information in a conversation with at least one other person. But because this is a very sensitive topic, then like with all of our conversation, please not only have the conversation and have it with using science and love, but also add to it compassion that the other person may have their own personal racial traumas, whether they are from one race or the other, that may make them uncomfortable to hear and resistant to hear. So, again, thank you for listening. That ends our time for today. And remember to continue this conversation using science and love. And if you run